Hello. I always feel like the autumn is a good time for reading some nonfiction, and so very handily, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction recently announced their long list. So I've started reading through these books, and it's a great reminder for me, as someone who reads a lot of novels, that nonfiction can often be more surprising and stranger than fiction. So there are 12 books on the long list, and the award very kindly sent me these books. I know it looks like there are some very big, thick ones here, but don't forget that nonfiction often includes extensive references and notes at the ends of the books. So I'm going to go through and discuss each of these titles individually, but I would love to hear in the comments below if you have read any of these books and what you think about them, or if you're interested in reading them now and following along with the prize. But before I get into the books, just a little brief overview of the award. So the Baillie Gifford Prize is the most prominent book award for nonfiction in the UK. They've been running since 1999. It used to be called the Samuel Johnson Prize, but the title of the award changed in 2015. And the winner receives £50,000, and each author on the shortlist also receives £5,000. And the shortlist is going to be announced very soon on October 2nd, and then the winner is going to be announced on November 4th. So the award is open to any author that has published a book of nonfiction in English in the past year, and it could be about any subject matter, from history to biography to sciences to nature. I'll put a link below to the awards website if you want to find out more about them. And now to get into these books. So I've read two books from the long list so far, and but I'm going to begin by talking about this biography, Electric Spark, The Enigma of Muriel Spark by Frances Wilson. And this looks especially at Muriel Spark's early life in the 40s and 50s, and how she went through a lot of tumultuous times to do with relationships and mental health and many struggles, and how this has been kind of distilled into her fiction. And she is one of the most prominent British writers, I think, from the past 50 years or so. I've read, I think, 5 or 6 of her books. I think her novel, Memento Mori, is an absolute masterpiece, and she is just such a fascinating figure. And so I'm going to be reading this biography with my book club in November. So there's Nonfiction November, which a lot of people on BookTube participate in. And this is the first nonfiction book that we'll have read together. And I held a poll recently, and this was voted as the favorite to read together. So I'm so excited to delve into this. And I think anyone, whether you have read Muriel Spark or not, could get a lot out of this book, because sometimes I will read biographies of authors, and so I have a kind of background information about their lives and then go into reading their fiction. But as someone who has read some of her novels and really enjoys them, I will be so fascinated to learn a lot more about her background. And Frances Wilson has written biographies of a number of literary figures before, and she has also been listed for the Baillie Gifford Prize in the past. Now, the first book I read from the list is Things in Nature Merely Grow by Yiyun Li, which is a memoir. And Yiyun Li had 2 sons, and she lost both of them to suicide, one in 2017 and one only last year in 2024. And of course, this is incredibly heartbreaking to read about, but I found this such a valuable reading experience as a way of looking at bereavement and processing the loss of someone close to you, as someone who really struggles to know how to deal with death, and reading about the experiences of someone who lost her sons in such tragic circumstances that it's almost unimaginable that this would happen. And she comments in this because she is a novelist, that if she wrote this in fiction, no one would believe it, but it actually happened to her. And there is so much wisdom and insight in this book about the process of bereavement and how to carry on with one's life when the worst thing imaginable has happened. I think it is incredibly powerful and moving book. Next, I read Daughters of the Bamboo Grove, China's Stolen Children and a Story of Separated Twins by Barbara Demick, who is a previous winner of this prize. And this is an account of twin girls that were born in China, and they were separated, and one was stolen by local authorities and trafficked into an orphanage and adopted by an American couple who thought that they were rescuing this girl from China under China's one-child policy, and that this girl wouldn't have had any chances in her family or in the world if she wasn't adopted. So they thought they were doing right, but these twin girls were separated, and the author follows the separate stories of these girls, both in China and in America, but also looks at the larger issue of this policy in China, how it impacted families and how it led to this corrupt system where local authorities would steal children because it became like big business, orphanages, and people from around the world adopting them from these orphanages. So it's incredibly heart-wrenching experience reading about this, but I so appreciated getting wider context about this issue in China, and it dispelled some myths for me about the history of the one-child policy and how the theory of this was debunked a long time ago, but how it persisted in the country for a really long time, and the incredibly emotional story of families that were separated from their children in these tragic circumstances, and following the particular relationship of these twin girls and their story over time. It is such a gripping tale, but also an absolutely fascinating one. John and Paul, A Love Story in Songs by Ian Leslie. And so this is a biographical account of John Lennon and Paul McCartney and the Beatles, in particular looking at their early lives and how their friendship and connection and relationship fed into their creative output and the creation of their songs. And it draws upon recently released footage and recordings. And I think it'll be so fascinating to read this and also listen to some of their songs, and then know about the background to some of these songs. And just recently I saw the film Spinal Tap 2, and I absolutely adored Paul McCartney's cameo in this. Oh, there they are together. How to End a Story, Collected Diaries by Helen Garner, who is a very prominent Australian novelist and journalist who I've been meaning to read for quite a while. But like I said, with Muriel Spark, I think it'll be really interesting to first approach her writing through these diaries, and if I like them, then to go on and read some of her fiction. And there are so many authors that have been really bigging up this book. There was an article in the summer about summer reads and authors recommending books, and so many authors cited this title, including David Nichols, who's a very big fan of her writing. So these diaries cover from the late 70s to the late 1990s, exploring her life as a writer, her process of trying to become published, but also her process of motherhood and being in a tumultuous, very conflicted marriage and partnership. And so it follows her life and impressions through a long period of time. Lone Wolf, Walking the Fault Lines of Europe by Adam Weymouth. So in 2011, a wolf in Slovenia crossed over the Alps into northern Italy, and there he met a female wolf. And there had not been wolves in this area of the country for a century. But after these two wolves met, there are now more than 100 wolves there out in the wild. And so Adam Weymouth follows the same path that the wolf took over the Alps and reflects upon the changing natural environment and the process of rewilding, but also about how politics and culture impact the environment around them. And Adam Weymouth, he is the winner of the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year award. Quite a while ago, he won that award, and I actually saw him win that award in the London Library. So yeah, it's really great to see that he is still publishing, and I'm so excited to read this now. The Revolutionists by Jason Burke. So in the 1970s, radical extremists started taking much more extreme measures in their terrorism, from plane hijackings to kidnappings, and this explores a number of cases and individuals involved in this, from the Munich Olympics to the Iranian Revolution. And he draws upon original interviews and recently declassified government documents to understand how and why this happened and how such radical extremism has changed over the past few decades. The Finest Hotel in Kabul, A People's History of Afghanistan by Lyse Doucet. So in 1969, the Hotel Intercontinental Kabul first opened, and this is a luxury hotel. But as we all know, in the past several decades, Afghanistan has gone through so many wars and conflicts, but throughout that entire time, this hotel has stayed open, and Lyse Doucet has spent a lot of time at this hotel, and she interviewed a number of its employees, and through these interviews with the staff that have kept this hotel open, she gives a very different perspective of Afghanistan from what we see in the news. And Lyse Doucet is the BBC's chief international correspondent. I often hear her being interviewed about issues to do with the Middle East, and she is so fascinating and has a very distinctive voice. So I think while I'm reading this, I'll be hearing her voice in my head, but it sounds like a very fascinating story. The Boundless Deep, Young Tennyson, Science, and the Crisis of Belief by Richard Holmes. Now, Alfred Lord Tennyson is probably best known as the gloomy poet laureate of the Victorian era, but in this book, Holmes gives a very different understanding of his life and the conflicts he was wrestling with throughout his life, and that were inspired by his difficult upbringing, but also how he was fascinated by the sciences and developments in science at the time, and how this fed into his own sense of depression and the tension he felt between loneliness and love and agnosticism and belief. And Richard Holmes has written biographical accounts of a number of literary figures, and also really fascinating, he is the husband of Rose Tremaine, whose writing I love. So I was really excited to discover that. And here's a picture of young Alfred Tennyson, looking very handsome. The Last Days of Budapest, Spies, Nazis, Rescuers, and Resistance by Adam LeBor. Throughout World War II, Budapest remained a relatively peaceful place, but that all changed dramatically in March of 1944 when Nazis marched into the city and implemented so many oppressive measures for the Jewish population. And so Adam LeBor explores the decimation of this city's population and its landscape. And he does this using uncovered diaries and archival material, as well as interviews with some of the few remaining survivors who still remember the city from that time and the dramatic change that it went through. Between the Waves, the hidden history of a very British revolution from 1945 to 2016 by Tom McTague. In 2016, the UK held a referendum about whether or not to stay in the EU, and the majority vote was to leave the EU. And for a lot of people, this seemed to come on as a big surprise that this was the decision, but the author of this book looks at the history of the UK's tense relationship with the European continent over this long period of time from the end of World War II up into the referendum, to try to understand how this came about and looking at the shifting politics of the country and this formation and understanding of what the UK is and what its relationship is exactly with larger Europe. So I'm hoping this will give some insight into how all of this happened. And finally, there is Captives and Companions, A History of Slavery and the Slave Trade in the Islamic World by Justin Marozzi. Slavery in the Islamic world has a long and complicated and controversial history, and throughout the century, there have been slaves who have been concubines and soldiers and domestic workers and agricultural laborers. And in this book, the author tries to bring to life the stories of these subjugated people and position them within this history. So those are all of the titles on this year's Baillie Gifford Prize long list, and I'm really looking forward to exploring more of these books. And if you want to join me and my book club in reading Electric Spark, I'll put a link to that in the description below. But I would love to hear if you have read any of these books and if you want to follow along with the prize. I'm going to be really interested to see what is shortlisted on October 2nd and, of course, what wins on November 4th. So thank you for watching me discuss all of these books and this prize, and I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.